Wir erleben gerade eine Zeit großer Umbrüche. Die westliche Hegemonie wird global in Frage gestellt. Mit dem BRICS keimt die multipolare Weltordnung heran. Auseinandersetzungen werden gewaltsam ausgetragen, wie etwa in der Ukraine oder im Nahen Osten. Da scheint der schottische Kampf für Unabhängigkeit doch eher am Rand des weltweiten Fokus zu stehen. Wo ordnen Sie die schottische Unabhängigkeitsbewegung in die globalen Entwicklungen ein? Welche Relevanz hat der Kampf Schottlands über die britischen Grenzen hinaus, auch für das deutsche Publikum?
Well, yeah, I mean, the global order is always in a state of flux. I think, I can certainly cast my mind back to times when I was younger, whether that was during the Cold War or in the Thatcher years, or indeed around the time of 9/11 attacks. We always felt that there was a tumult and a change, and certainly all of those events had an influence on geopolitics. And what's very difficult to predict is what the consequences will ultimately, what they will be. So I think the most important thing for anyone is to continue to pay close attention to all of the players in these massive events and try and get a sense of where the world is headed, because, we have the US presidential elections in a matter of days, and we have two extraordinarily different candidates. In fact, they couldn't be further apart in a whole range of different ways in their presentation, their character, their policies, and their support. But we are in a very polarized world, and that, I think, exemplifies the polarization that happens, that's been happening, certainly in a more significant way over the last couple of decades. So the American election is an example, but one example of polarization. We have very polarized views around what's happening in the Middle East, whether you are pro-Israeli or pro-Palestine state. And we also have that in smaller politics, but on a global stage, when it comes to sex and gender, again, a very polarizing and difficult debate that has had a direct influence on Scotland and Scottish politics, and most notably on the cause of independence, because it's that issue that has become a very significant wedge issue within the movement, and that is, personified, I guess, by Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond. But the problems that Scotland has in terms of asserting and exerting its influence on geopolitics, I think, has less to do with how irrelevant or relevant the cause of Scottish independence is, and much more to do with the strength of leadership, the moral fibre, the rod of iron that exists in government, that important role of guiding a nation towards its destination. That is sadly absent, and has been conspicuously absent for the 10 years since Alec left office. So Alec absolutely leaves an enormous gap in Scottish, UK, and indeed global politics, because he was a widely respected commentator on all political issues across the globe. And so his insight and wisdom will be sorely missed by many. But I think, at the end of the day, in terms of the relevance and how we keep Scottish politics relevant in all of this and Scotland's independence is, well, it all comes down to justice. Ultimately, and that's a thread that runs through so many of these issues, is truth, justice, courage, and the importance of being committed to doing the right thing. And so I think our argument, whilst we are in a difficult place within the independence movement, our argument remains absolutely solid, that it is only right and proper that a distinct group of peoples, for the sake of international law, the people of Scotland, have an inalienable human right to choose the form of government that they wish. And any attempts to try and hide from that, as Kemi Badenoch has tried to do, asserting that we're in a voluntary union, but you can't leave. Their arguments expose the mendacity at the core of them whenever they're spoken. So I'm confident that the independence movement will regalvanise, and we will need to find new leadership. But there is one thing that cannot be denied. Alex Salmond set us on this journey. He is the leader of the independence movement, both in life and now in his surviving legacy.
Eine aktuelle Umfrage gibt an, dass 52% der Befragten sich für die Unabhängigkeit aussprechen. Aber ist das wirklich ein Thema, was viele Schotten im Alltag bewegt? Oder geht es da mehr um Fragen der beruflichen Sicherheit, der wirtschaftlichen Schieflage in Großbritannien, dem enormen Anstieg von Heiz- und Lebensmittelkosten, der Inflation und der sinkenden Reallöhne und Renten? Welchen Stellenwert hat die Frage nach der Unabhängigkeit für die Schotten selbst?
Well, the two are indivisible. That's the reality of the situation. Whilst people are struggling with the day-to-day challenges, whether that's the cuts to the winter fuel payments for pensioners, which Alec was very passionate about in the days before his death, and the legal challenge that's been mounted by the Fannings, a couple who are working with Govan Law Centre, and now Joanna Cherry, former MP for the SNP. Those bread and butter issues are really important, but what you can't escape is that central to that is the choice to make the decisions that are right for the people of Scotland. And so all of these day-to-day issues, whether it's NHS funding, education, access to the European markets, all of those issues, whilst they are important issues in and of themselves, they are subsidiary to the fundamental question about whether the people of Scotland have the right to choose how to address those challenges through their own government, rather than to have decisions foisted upon us by a remote government in London.
Die ALBA Party und die gesamte Bewegung für Schottlands Unabhängigkeit musste Mitte Oktober einen schweren Verlust hinnehmen. Mit dem überraschenden Tod des Parteivorsitzenden Alex Salmond verliert Schottland seinen prominentesten Befürworter der Unabhängigkeit, den Antreiber und das Gesicht der gesamten Bewegung. Können Sie umreißen, welche Rolle Salmond in den 50 Jahren seiner politischen Aktivität für die schottische Unabhängigkeit gespielt hat? Wo stand Schottland damals? Wo heute?
Well, I think the best way that I can describe that really is, so at Alex's funeral service on Tuesday, I met a fantastic independence campaigner called Duncan Hamilton, who's now an exceptional lawyer. He's a KC. But back in the day, he was a member of the Scottish Parliament, and he was a great speaker. And he gave this speech at Glasgow University in November of 2011, which was really, for me, embodied the optimism and confidence that Alex Salmond instilled in the people of Scotland during his time as our First Minister. And in those words, it became so apparent that independence was not only possible, it was probable, and it was proximal, so it was close to happening. What we've seen in the 10 years since Alec was stood down as First Minister is that a distance from the confidence and in the cause of independence is diminished with the people. And the arguments are not being articulated with that same enthusiasm that Duncan Hamilton gave on that day. And so I think that's less to do, well, it's as much to do with Alec not being First Minister, but it's also equally as much to do with the small ambition of those who followed him and the consequences of their inaction on the movement. But, you know, the point that you raised about support for independence is a really important one. So even in all of this, you know, lack of action and lack of progress in the 10 years hence, the support for independence is continuing to grow. And the confidence that the people of Scotland have in that cause is continuing to grow. And that's in absolute absence of any campaign or any destination towards independence being identified. So I think the cause of independence is alive and well in the hearts and minds of people, because the inspiration that Alex Salmond delivered to the Scottish people in that festival of democracy that we had in the lead up to the 2014 referendum is still very much present. And what we need now is for people to come together and push forward in Alex's memory to deliver his dream of independence. And so, yeah, I mean, Alec will always be present. There is a gap. We won't hear his words and thoughts again, but we can look back on the lessons that he taught us over many, many years to help us chart a pathway forward.
Ihre eigene Partei verliert mit Salmond nicht nur den Vorsitzenden, sondern auch die bekannteste Persönlichkeit, national wie international. Bei den vergangenen Parlamentswahlen im Juli hat die ALBA Party kaum 12.000 Stimmen bekommen und somit ihre 2 Sitze im britischen Unterhaus verloren, auch ihren. Wie geht es nun weiter mit der ALBA Party? Wie wird sie die Lücke schließen, die durch Salmonds Tod gerissen wurde?
Well, the bottom line is, as long as there is a need for a party absolutely committed to Scottish independence, there will always be a need for the ALBA Party to exist. You know, look, Alec inherited a party that was on the political fringes some decades ago, and he took that party from the political fringes into the mainstream and into government. So we're a new party, we're a young party, we have a lot to demonstrate, but we know absolutely that in the immediate aftermath of 2014, the SNP saw their membership grow to 120,000 members. I think it was 125, from a membership of around about 26,000 before the referendum. And we also know that around about 50 to 70,000 of those members have since left the SNP because they have lost all confidence in the SNP to deliver on Scottish independence. They have had so many opportunities, some of the best opportunities you could ever wish for, and they have not only dropped the ball, they have failed to even try and score a goal. And I think that we know that support is out there. We know that there are 52% of the population now in favour of Scottish independence. So it's our job, absolutely, I take it on the chin, but I didn't have particularly high expectations of winning my seat in any case, but that's a separate issue. But it's our job now to convince the people of Scotland that they need to chart a different course on independence, that if the SNP are the vehicle towards independence, then it's been parked up a cul-de-sac and has run out of fuel. And that's not good enough. That's not something I'm going to accept. So we will always campaign first and foremost for independence. And it's our job to win hearts and minds of people in Scotland, as Alec did all those years before he became First Minister of Scotland. It takes hard work.
Lassen Sie uns nun den Blick auf die globalen Entwicklungen lenken. Das Vereinigte Königreich gilt als der treueste Alliierte der USA. Die britische Regierung unterstützt, egal unter welchem Premierminister, vehement die Ukraine und Israel. London liefert Panzer, Kanonen und Marschflugkörper an Kiew. Britische Kampfjets agieren im Nahen Osten, bombardieren die Houthi in Jemen und fangen iranische Raketen ab zum Schutz Israels. Großbritannien ist eine tragende Säule der NATO und positioniert sich klar gegen Russland, gegen China und die BRICS. Welche Sicht haben die Schotten auf die britische Geopolitik? Tragen sie den Kurs der britischen Regierung mit?
Well, I don't think it's just Scotland that have considerable concerns about the UK government position on Palestine, for example, and the conflict that's happening between the Palestinians, Israelis, and their neighbours. Alex's view on all of this really was always one of seeking dialogue and looking for peace, but also, again, I return to that central theme of justice. I mean, justice was something that Alec sought to deliver for every constituent or business or world leader that spoke to him, was to try and find the just route through. And so it's imperative that we try and view things through a prism of justice, morality, and the like, as I think he would have done. And the British public, in that broadest sense, including the Scottish people, look at the choices of both the Conservative government prior to the Labour government we have now, and they are in very strong disagreement with, I think, not necessarily their sympathy for Israel as a state to exist. I don't think there's a huge amount of debate around that question, and I think it's important to draw that distinction. But what they have witnessed in terms of the aggression that has been visited, and the atrocities that have been visited on the ordinary people of Palestine as a consequence to, an absolutely horrendous attack on October the 7th. There's no debate or discussion around that. It was appalling. But it just seems completely imbalanced. There doesn't seem to be the support for the government's enthusiasm for that kind of endeavour. And so the government have a real problem when it comes to their policy on Israel and Palestine. And I think that's also true in Scotland, because, whilst our party has a very, very clear policy position on the conflict, and it has been thus since the 10th of October, I think, 10th or 11th of October, when we published our policy statement or position statement on that, and that has been reaffirmed by our conference. But the current Scottish government don't have a formal policy on what's happening there, although there has been some internal conflict within the party where a member who dismissed any notion of a genocide was subsequently ejected from the party. So, but that's an internal matter for the SNP to consider. So, in terms of the government policy, it's completely out of step with the people of Scotland. I mean, I think, you'll find people who exist on the polls, as I've mentioned before, but in the middle, there is certainly much more concern, which comes from a motivation that I think I am motivated from, which is from the humanitarian dimension of any conflict, that it just seems disproportionate to inflict such devastation on a defenseless population in the pursuit of imagined extremists, and to do that without any regard for women and children in particular. And the loss of life has been utterly extraordinary. And I have met with people who have lost every member of their extended family, even those who tried to comply with Israeli instructions to move to South Gaza in the early days of the incursion.
Die israelische Kriegsführung hat seit Oktober letzten Jahres über 40.000 Todesopfer auf Seiten der Palästinenser gefordert. Ein Großteil davon Frauen und Kinder. Die Schotten blicken selbst zurück auf einen jahrhundertelangen Kampf gegen Unterdrückung und für ihre Freiheit. Dafür wurden sie von England vielfach brutal bestraft. Welche Wirkung hat das Vorgehen Israels gegen die Palästinenser, das von zahlreichen Stimmen als Völkermord tituliert wird, auf die Schotten? Gibt es den Gedanken, das könnten auch wir sein?
Well, you could draw parallels between the clearances and some of the actions of the British military in Scotland. You can draw parallels with other conflicts of genocide across the world, whether historically or more recently, genocide in Rwanda, for example. I think the most important thing to focus on now is what's actually happening now, rather than historical parallels. I think historical parallels are for the hereafter, so after the conflict has been resolved. But now what we need to try and understand is You know, who are the players in here? Are they acting within the boundaries of international law? Do the criminal courts, the international criminal courts, have sufficient teeth to bring those guilty of war crimes before them? Is there sufficient activity and support from other nations to make that happen? What other sanctions and options can be made available through either the United Nations or indeed other international organizations to put pressure on both sides to come to the table and resolve this conflict? Because the people are the ones who are suffering. You know, it's a kind of off the cuff thing, but I always reflected back on wars and thought that so many ordinary people, decent people, lost their lives because of a quarrel of very powerful men and women. And it is ever thus. So there are powerful people on both sides who have very polarized views, who won't give an inch, and they want to seem strong and resilient to their supporters. But actually, in the middle of all of this, there is a huge number of people who are losing everything, including their lives, to this pointless conflict.
Können Sie bitte beschreiben, in welchem Ausmaß die Bürger Schottlands selbst entscheiden können über ihre Politik? Wie ist Schottland eingebunden in das politische System Großbritanniens? Welche Entscheidungen trifft London, welche das schottische Volk? Kann Schottland sich überhaupt außenpolitisch artikulieren?
Well, not formally, no. And every time the Scottish government have tried to engage with the international community, the UK government have slapped them down because it is not a devolved area of responsibility. And so technically, they're correct. And whilst they may be technically correct, it does reveal how little the views of the people of Scotland are valued by the UK state, because there is no mechanism, no formal mechanism for the Scottish Parliament to directly engage with or influence foreign policy beyond a letter from the First Minister saying he's disappointed, which is really not of tremendous value. And recently, the UK government has brought in a new organisation, a new grouping of the nations and regions of the United Kingdom to come together. And now, one of Alex's last comments made on social media was a tweet in which he made this very important, an absolutely compelling point about Scotland's place at such a regional committee. And that is that Scotland is a country, not a county. And so for Scotland's First Minister to not only participate in such a meeting, but to have his selfie taken with regional leaders from England really diminishes Scotland's standing within the UK, and it's simply unacceptable. But you know, and so if you are treated like a region and you accept that, then you know you deserve to be treated in that way. But Scotland should be making its case on the international stage and making its presence felt on the international stage across a whole range of foreign policy issues. There's nothing to stop politicians voicing a view, and that's something that Alex did with gusto and wisdom throughout his career.
Schottland ist eine Nation, kein Bundesland. Was wäre nötig, um als souveränes Land zu handeln? Hat ein schottischer First Minister überhaupt eine Chance, Schritte in Richtung einer schottischen Außenpolitik zu unternehmen?
Well, I mean, you can't formally take those steps, but you can certainly work your way around it. You know, you can't instruct civil servants to undertake duties that they're not you know, part of that. You know, don't have that departmental responsibility. So that's not something you can do. But it certainly doesn't stop you from moving motions in the Scottish Parliament. It doesn't stop you from speaking to global media about the view of the people of Scotland. And it certainly doesn't stop you from consulting with the people of Scotland to get a deep understanding of where they are. Because, you know, when you listen to the people and you begin to speak to others about their shared values of the people of Scotland, then you embolden them to action. You give them the confidence that their opinion matters, that they matter as a people, and that Scotland's voice deserves to be seen, heard and recognised on the global stage.
Die koloniale Vergangenheit holt das Vereinigte Königreich ein. Dem britischen Monarchen Charles III. Wurde auf seiner Reise durch die Commonwealth-Staaten im Pazifik von Vertretern eingeborener Völker die Ehrung verweigert. Ehemalige britische Kolonien wie Jamaika oder Barbados schließen sich zusammen und fordern Reputationszahlungen aus London für erlebte Verbrechen während der Kolonialzeit, insbesondere für den Sklavenhandel. Die Beratungsfirma Brattle Group hat vergangenes Jahr berechnet, dass Großbritannien allein für den Sklavenhandel 24 Billionen US-Dollar an Reputationen zahlen müsste. Das entspricht ungefähr 15 Mal den jährlichen britischen Staatsausgaben. Sollten diese tatsächlich politisch erkämpft werden, würde es auch den schottischen Haushalt treffen, solange Schottland Teil des Vereinigten Königreichs ist. Wie werden diese Forderungen der ehemaligen Kolonien in Schottland gesehen?
Well, I mean, I can't say that I am in a position to speak for the people of Scotland on this. I mean, I can give you my own reflections on it. I think that's part of a wider conversation and a deeper understanding of Scotland's active role in the slave trade, particularly on the west coast and in and around Glasgow. But I think the one point that I would make is that the UK government spent a significant sum of money in reparations to the wrong people. And so when slavery was outlawed, the slave owners were compensated for their losses at that time to an extraordinary sum. And so that money has compensated them for the most horrendous abuses of humanity, taking people as slaves. And so it seems to me that there needs to be some reflection on recovery of those monies, because those people are still profiting from that compensation. That compensation went on to build prosperous, very prosperous livings and lifestyles for those who were compensated. So there's a question about is that or any part of that money recoverable? I don't know if that's a possible thing to do. And then the second question is, what is the purpose of reparations going forward? I mean, is the purpose of the reparation to completely cripple the offending country, which it may well do, or is there a population that deserve compensation within the affected population? I mean, I'm in favour of reparations, but it has to be done in a measured way. I mean, I think that Scotland has a great claim on reparations from the UK, given that throughout my life, the British state have and continue to take energy from Scotland for absolute free. And we have, we're the only country in the world to discover a vast oil reserve and to see our people get poorer. And we now face the prospect of being the only oil-producing nation in the world that doesn't have its own refinery capacity. So there's reparations and there are reparations. I mean, I'm not in the issue closely enough to understand the deeper issues at play, but on basic principle, there have been reparations in other countries where the affected population have been compensated. I'm thinking New Zealand and certainly in parts of Canada and the like. But I think it's being made into a bit of a virtue signalling, polarizing issue, when actually it should be a mature and constructive conversation, and there needs to be some real thought given to how the issue is progressed and what the purpose is. That's the fundamental thing for me. What is the purpose? Is the purpose punitive and punishment of the current population for the wrongs of the past? That's whether that's the purpose or the effect, is debatable. And who is the compensation for? Because we can't, with the best will in the world, we can't repair the damage that was done to people who were forced into slavery. And likewise, we already have a very significant international problem with modern slavery. So, there are a number of questions around this issue that are probably require a more global approach rather than a combative approach between different nation states.
Wir sprachen bereits über die bitteren Jahrhunderte der Unterdrückung Schottlands durch die englische Herrschaft. Kann man auch im Fall Schottlands von einer Kolonialisierung sprechen? Und wird auch Schottland irgendwann Reputationsansprüche an London stellen?
I mean, it's not a central pillar of the independence argument, because I think, we have an optimistic, certainly in my party and during my time in the wider Yes movement, we have a very optimistic view of Scotland's ability to not only succeed but to prosper. We are replete with energy, whether that's North Sea oil and gas, wind, tidal and wave technologies, all of which the development of have been stymied by Westminster. So the good bit of that is that means the opportunities continue to exist, and so we'll be able to exploit them when we do become independent. But also the infrastructure that's being put in place by the UK national grid to extract energy from the North Sea, from wind turbines up there, so subsea cables that are being laid down into London and the southeast, where Scotland currently generates over 12 times the amount of renewable energy than we can possibly consume. So there is a huge reserve of energy there for us to make a good fist of things going forward. So I think the only reparation I would stipulate at this time would be that we'll put meters at the top end of those subsea cables so that we can properly bill the UK or the remaining UK state for the energy that they take from Scotland, rather than allowing them to take it for free into the future. So I don't think there's an appetite for that. There may be some voices who look for reparations, and there's probably a very strong case for it, particularly given the contents of the Macron report, where the UK state knew that Scotland was headed for an embarrassment of riches, the report's own words, and they hid that from the people of Scotland for decades. So there's probably a case for reparation, but it's not my focus. I want to see the people of Scotland, have the government of their choosing and be free to flourish and prosper in the years ahead.
Lassen Sie uns zum Abschluss über die Zukunft Schottlands sprechen. Glauben Sie, dass Schottland in absehbarer Zeit unabhängig sein wird? Auf welchem Weg will die ALBA Party dorthin kommen? Wird es ein neues Referendum geben?
Yeah. Okay. So, look, the opportunity to be an independent state is not within the gift of the predecessor states. So the UK, under international law, should play no part in the role of the identified peoples in exerting their right to self-determination. And I make that point not from my own musings, but that is the recommendation from Professor Robert McCorquodale, who provided a written legal opinion to me when I was a Member of Parliament about the right to self-determination. So there's a fundamental question there about the justified locus of the UK in whether they will confer that right or not. Now, where it gets a little bit tricky is that the Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament is not a Scottish entity. Okay, it's called Scottish, but it's not a Scottish entity. It's a British entity. It's a conceit of the UK state to give the appearance of self-government, but it's a devolved legislature. So it's not a Scottish government. It's not a Scottish Parliament. And so when the UK states say that we will not give the power to the Scottish Parliament to hold a further referendum, that is true, and that's within the apparatus of the UK state. But what they can't say is we will deny the people of Scotland the right to express their democratically held opinion on the case for independence. Now, what you need to measure that wish is a democratic event, because you can't. There are some people in our movement who think that going back into historical documents will somehow magically set Scotland free from the UK state. And as alluring and tempting as that might be, you can't do that if the people haven't given their consent. And so the consent of the people is essential. So you have to find a democratic event in which to do that. Now, our view is that the best way to do that is on the list portion of the Holyrood general election. So we have a constituency first past the post contest, and then we have a list de haunt system where seats are allocated differently for over the regions. And so the regional list system would allow us to have a very straight choice between either parties or a combination of parties who are putting forward the case for Scottish independence. And so if you get over 50% on that, you have passed the democratic test. You have expressly used a democratic event to test the opinion of the people of Scotland. And if they give their consent for independence, it would be, I think, unthinkable that the international community would dismiss that expression of desire to become an independent country. You know, if you look back at all of the other countries who seceded from the British Empire, none of them did it through a referendum. They all took the position internally in their democratic elections to make the case for seceding from the UK. And that should be absolutely the same for Scotland. They also have the perverse situation in Scotland where, whilst the Northern Ireland Act and the Scotland Act both came into effect at roughly the same time, whereas in the Northern Ireland Act, there is a democratic provision to test their constitutional position every 7 years. And despite my best efforts to introduce a similar amendment to the Scotland Act when I was an MP, that did not happen. So there's a disparity with the internal democracy in the UK that again reinforces the case for Scotland's right to self-determination, albeit in a rather uncomfortable way.
Was wäre also nötig, um die schottische Nation zu manifestieren? Bräuchte man eine Art Nationalversammlung wie in der Französischen Revolution?
Well, I mean, yes. So you need the democratic event. So you can either test that through an election. It needs to be a national election, needs to be a decent turnout, etc. And a Scottish parliamentary election is the perfect vehicle because the electorate for that election is more broad. It includes foreign nationals and 16-year-olds. So it's a better opportunity to capture the mood of the whole country through that vehicle. But going back to the point I made about the Scottish Parliament being part of the UK state apparatus, that means that they can't communicate the right to secession because they are constrained by the devolved competencies that they have. So that's not within their gift to say we're declaring independence and seceding from the Union. So what you then have to have is some Scottish convention, independence convention that includes political operators from across the political spectrum who recognise the democratic will of the Scottish people, but also Civic Scotland and other leaders in Scotland to come together. And it's from that body that the message would be communicated to the UK government. That is the correct mechanism to use. That's the advice of Professor McCorquodale, and that route is absolutely crystal clear. The problem that we have is that Nicola Sturgeon took a rather obscure question to the UK Supreme Court, which was about the competencies of the Scottish government, not about the rights of the Scottish people. And the UK Supreme Court gave her the answer that everybody predicted they would, despite some significant overreach in their findings. And so the lack of appetite, the biggest frustration and roadblock, impediment, whatever you want to call it, to delivering Scotland's independence is currently the SNP Scottish Government.
Liebe Zuschauer, wenn euch unsere Beiträge gefallen, teilt sie unbedingt in den sozialen Medien. Abonniert unseren Kanal und drückt auf die Glocke, damit ihr keine Veröffentlichung von Gegenpol verpasst.